Hi, VencoreWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian here. Well, we are now into the early part of May. Time once again to take a look at the tropical outlook for the Atlantic Basin. The hurricane season in the Atlantic Basin runs officially from June 1st to December 1st, but of course you can have a tropical system any time of the calendar year. We'll also take a look at the Mid-Atlantic summertime outlook with respect to temperatures and precipitation. Whenever you're looking at a longer range forecast, specifically a tropical outlook, sea surface temperature anomalies are critical, and we will focus in on the ongoing El Nino in the tropical part of the Pacific Ocean. In addition, we'll look at sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. Kind of an interesting pattern going on right now with respect to sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic Ocean. There's a dichotomy going on, a contrast between colder than normal temperatures in the eastern Atlantic off the west coast of Africa and pockets of very warm water, warmer than normal water over the Gulf of Mexico, off the southeast U.S. coast over the Bahama Islands, for example, and off the mid-Atlantic and northeast U.S. coast. So western Atlantic, warmer than normal conditions, contrasting with eastern Atlantic, colder than normal conditions. Also like to take a look at a couple other factors that certainly can play a role in the mid-Atlantic summertime outlook, namely Great Lakes ice cover content during the prior winter months. We had back-to-back very cold winters over the Great Lakes region that led to record-breaking ice cover extent. In fact, right now in the early part of May, there's still more than 5% of ice cover in Lake Superior. Just a couple of weeks ago, at the latter part of April, they had record-high ice cover content for so late in the season. There has been found to be a correlation between those cold winters with high ice cover content in the Great Lakes and the temperature pattern in the Mid-Atlantic region during the subsequent summertime months of June, July, and August. Also, soil moisture is a critical thing to look at in terms of the potential for summertime heat and drought. Basically, for summertime heat and drought to occur, you really need dry soil moisture. We do not have that now, thanks in large part to above normal snowfall over the winter and some early spring rains. We have relatively normal soil moisture, and we'll talk about that over the next several minutes. Before we get into the details, one final interesting point. We have been blessed in the U.S. with not having a major hurricane hit, that's a category 3, 4, or 5, since October of 2005. We have pretty good records of tropical storm activity in the Atlantic Basin going all the way back to the middle 1800s, and there has not ever been in that time period a drought like this with respect to major hurricanes. Let's hope our luck continues. We've been very fortunate over the last 9+ years with respect to major hurricane hits. The last hit was Hurricane Wilma, I believe Wilma in October of 2005, that record-breaking year, and I believe it hit Florida as a category 3 late in that tropical season. Well, let's start off with the all-important sea surface temperature anomaly pattern. This is as we ended the month of April, headed into the month of May. A few different areas I want to focus in on. First of all, this line right here represents the equator. This horizontal line is a latitude of 0 degrees. Notice all this yellow and orange area right at the equator in the Pacific Ocean. This is the west coast of South America right here. This is indicative of the ongoing El Nino, a warmer than normal temperature pattern in the sea off the west coast of South America. All indications are that this El Nino will not only continue during the summer months, but perhaps strengthen from a weak El Nino to a moderately strong El Nino. That has a direct impact on the tropical outlook in the Atlantic Basin, as well as an impact on the temperature pattern across the U.S. in the summertime. Now, you might wonder, why does El Nino have an impact on the tropical season here in the Atlantic? Well, history has shown, research and empirical evidence has shown that El Ninos in the summertime tend to cause an increase in upper-level winds across the tropical Atlantic. High-level vertical wind shear tends to inhibit tropical storm formation in the tropical Atlantic. Basically, the storms tend to rip apart before they have a chance to strengthen into a circulating type of tropical system. So El Nino in the Pacific tends to increase upper level winds and vertical wind shear in the tropical Atlantic, which in turn tends to be an inhibiting factor in tropical storm formation in the Atlantic basin. In addition to El Nino, what's going on right now in the eastern Atlantic Ocean is an inhibiting factor. Notice this area of blue, this is colder than normal water off the west coast of Africa. Africa right here, the west coast of Africa. This is another inhibiting factor to tropical storm formation in the tropical Atlantic. The main breeding ground region for tropical storms in the Atlantic extends from the west coast of Africa all the way into the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and off the east coast of the U.S. And one of the requirements for tropical storm formation is very warm sea surface temperatures. 80 or even 85 degree sea surface temperature is required for the formation of tropical storms anytime you have a colder than normal pattern. And this is quite similar to a year ago as we headed into the 2014 tropical season. This is an inhibiting factor. So right now we have two sea surface temperature anomaly patterns that tends to suggest a below normal season. One, the El Nino in the tropical Pacific, and two, the eastern Atlantic colder than normal temperature pattern. On the other hand, we have a dichotomy going on here in the Atlantic Ocean with a contrast between colder than normal temperatures here in the eastern Atlantic and warmer than normal pockets of water here represented by the orange areas off the east coast, over the Bahamas, over the Gulf of Mexico, and this will tend to increase the amount of homegrown, what I like to call homegrown storms that do not take that long trek across the Atlantic Ocean from off the African coast, but rather form quickly, often quickly, right off the U.S. southeast coast or off the Gulf of Mexico coast. This homegrown type pattern tends to be dominant early in the tropical season, perhaps in May, June, and July, and then again late in the tropical season, late September, October, even November. So we'll watch for that possibility during this upcoming tropical season. But the main factors are probably the El Nino and the eastern Atlantic colder than normal pattern, which both tend to inhibit tropical storm formation. Well, again, El Nino is critical not only for the tropical Atlantic outlook, but also for the temperature pattern across the U.S., as we'll see over the next couple of minutes. This is supporting evidence here for not only an ongoing El Nino, but perhaps a strengthening El Nino over the next few months. This is a compilation of computer forecast models put together at Columbia University that predict what El Nino will do over the next several months. This line right here represents neutral condition. All forecasts that go below this line are in La Nina territory. This is colder than normal tropical Pacific sea surface temperatures. Meanwhile, anything above this line is an El Nino type of pattern. We are now currently right here, basically a weak El Nino, but notice the general idea, the general average of all these computer forecasts is for a strengthening over the next few months. Here, right in this region, this yellow line represents basically the average of these models. This is June, July, and August right here, July, August, September. So all indications are that El Nino will not only continue, but perhaps strengthen over the next few months, probably to a moderately strength El Nino. I don't expect a super strong El Nino to form, and then late in the calendar year, it'll tend to taper off and weaken as we approach 2016. But no doubt there's ample evidence for El Nino to continue over the next few months. Well, what kind of impact does El Nino have on summertime temperature patterns across the U.S.? This map was put together by Capital Weather Gang, and it has a compilation of temperature anomalies in El Nino years. And notice a widespread area of cooler than normal conditions in El Nino summers. This is certainly one signal for a cooler than normal temperature pattern here in the Mid-Atlantic region, given the fact that we expect an El Nino pattern to continue in the equatorial Pacific throughout the summer months. A widespread area of cooler than normal temperatures. Not every single El Nino summer featured cooler than normal conditions in the mid-Atlantic region, but perhaps 7 out of 10, so 70% chance here of a cooler than normal summer based on the idea that El Nino will continue. Well, we just looked at the impact that El Nino has on temperature pattern across the U.S. during the summertime. What about those years where the winter featured record high or near record high ice cover content on the Great Lakes? Well, there's a definite pattern in those summertime, June, July, August time periods that followed record high extent ice cover content in the Great Lakes region. Typically cooler than normal temperature pattern existed. Certainly in the north central U.S., across the Great Lakes and in the mid-Atlantic region. This is an average of several of those years which featured record high or near record high ice cover content in the Great Lakes, including last year of 2014. Again, ice is still existing on Lake Superior, perhaps more than 5% as we begin the early part of May. And just a couple of weeks ago, there was record high ice cover content for this late in the season. Now, it's not the ice cover itself that produces a cooler than normal temperature pattern across the Great Lakes and Mid-Atlantic region. It's more likely the pattern that generated that high ice cover content in the first place tends to persist for several months after the winter. So we have the El Nino suggesting a cooler than normal summer in the Mid-Atlantic region, and we have this pattern right here with those summer times that followed high ice cover content winters in the Great Lakes region, typically featuring cooler than normal conditions across the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic region. Well, one other factor I'd like to take a look at again has to do with soil moisture. Typically for a very hot, dry summer with drought, you need dry soil moisture conditions going into that summertime time period. And because of the above normal snowpack that we experienced here in the Mid-Atlantic region during the winter time and early spring rainfall, we have basically normal, relatively normal soil moisture content right now. The yellows or oranges represent dry soil moisture, the green wetter than normal soil moisture conditions at the end of April. But notice here, up and down the I-95 corridor, basically nothing going on here in terms of a color pattern here. In other words, it's near normal right here in the Mid-Atlantic I-95 corridor region. So this is a kind of a neutral signal going into the summer months. It does not suggest we'll have a hot, dry summer with extensive drought, however, but the relatively normal conditions leads to the possibility of a normal temperature pattern or perhaps even cooler than normal. Again, thanks in large part to the above normal snowpack that we experienced during the past winter season. Well, let's now summarize all of this, both with respect to the tropical outlook in the Atlantic Basin and then with respect to the Mid-Atlantic summertime outlook for temperatures and precipitation. Because of the ongoing and strengthening El Nino and because of the eastern Atlantic colder than normal temperature pattern, I tend to believe we'll have a below normal year. However, with the warmer than normal temperatures across the western Atlantic, there may be more in the way of homegrown type storms, especially early and late in the tropical season, and certainly any one of those can have an impact on the U.S. I expect 8 to 10 named storms, 3 to 5 of which will reach hurricane status, and again, because of the colder than normal temperature pattern in the eastern Atlantic off the west coast of Africa, those African wave type storms should be below normal, and they tend to dominate in August and September. Well, here's the summary chart for the Mid-Atlantic summertime outlook with respect to temperatures and precipitation. Again, given the fact that we have relatively normal soil moisture content and a decent early season, early springtime rainfall, hot, dry weather is probably the least likely to occur this summer. I do not expect any excessively hot or excessively dry, long-term drought, anything like that in the summer. All in all, probably near normal in terms of precipitation and anywhere from normal to cooler than normal temperature pattern in the Mid-Atlantic region. Again, two factors suggest we could have normal to cooler than normal temperature patterns. The ongoing El Nino and the ice cover content that we experienced this winter in the Great Lakes pattern, both of which suggest potential cooler than normal summer. We had a very nice summer last summer in the Mid-Atlantic region, and all in all, it looks like that will occur again this summer for June, July, and August. We'll, of course, monitor this over the next several weeks here at VencoreWeather.com. That's it for now. I'm VencoreWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian.